Welcome back everybody. Today I thought we will finish up these taillights, and I guess I could just put a bulb in there and be done with it, but what's the fun in that? And all the other lights on my bike are LEDs, and I think my taillight should be as well. I know a lot of you are interested in these kinds of electronic projects, and I know a lot of you are scared of them as well. So today I will show you there's nothing to be scared about. And even though this won't be a full tutorial, it will be a nice introduction to schematics, making your own PCB, soldering, and just making a little thing that will shine in your taillight. So let me just grab a seat and we can get started. Alright, just a quick summary of what we're making today. We are making a small PCB that will fit inside this lens, and it will hold a bunch of LEDs. And it will act as a running light and a stoplight. And to make a PCB, you need a schematic. And you can make that with pen and paper, the old school way, or you can use a software in your computer. Historically, I've been using KiCad. It's open source and it's free to use and it's very advanced. It's not hard, but it's advanced. For this project, I have tried another software called EasyEDA, and it's also free to use and it runs inside your browser. One nice thing about that is that it's connected to LCSC, a components distributor. So you have all the components in the world basically right there in your software. I know you can make that happen in KiCad as well using plugins and stuff, but in EasyEDA it's just there right out of the box. In order to make this video a bit shorter, I will just cut to the chase and show you my finished schematic. It's right here. It might look advanced at first, but it's really not that hard. Let me walk you through it. It's basically 16 LEDs wired into groups by 4. If I would wire them all in series like a Christmas light, they just wouldn't turn on. There isn't enough power. So instead I have 4 lights in series creating 4 groups, and those groups are then wired in parallel. And down here I have a resistor for each group just to tame the power a bit. And there are a bunch of calculators online that will help you calculate the value of that resistance. Now, another nice thing about having 4 groups in parallel is that you don't have a single point of failure. If one of these LEDs burn out, you still have 3 more groups that works. I guess you can consider that a safety feature if you're into those. These 3 components down here controls the brake light. For the running light, the power comes in here, goes through a diode, I will talk about that diode in a second, and then through a resistor, and then into all the LEDs. And that resistor is there to dim the lights a bit more. And the power for the brake light comes in here and rounds that resistor and goes straight to the LEDs, giving the LEDs the full 12 volts. That means that the LEDs will shine at full brightness when you hit the brakes. And the 2 diodes here are to stop the power from flowing back. Electricity is like water, it wants to flow everywhere it can. But with a diode, it can only flow in one direction. So if you send power to the run here, it will try to flow back down to the brake, but it can't. It stops right there. And the same goes if we put power to the brake, it can't flow down into the run. And that is a safety feature you actually need. When it comes time to design your PCB, you need to make an important decision. What type of component you are going to use. There are 2 types of components that I will talk about in this video, and those are through-hole components, THT, through-hole technology, and surface mount components, SMD, or SMT if you want to be special. The through-hole components does, well, you guessed it, go through holes in the PCB and you solder them from the backside. Through-hole components are easy to find, easy to mount, easy to solder, and they can handle a lot of power. The drawback is that they can be quite large, and they take up space on both sides of the PCB. Surface-mounted components, on the other hand, are most of the time a bit cheaper, but they can be harder to find. Your local electronics shop might not have them, but there are plenty of places online where you can order them. They are also way harder to mount and to solder into place. Look at this size comparison. It gives you quite a good idea on just how tiny these things are. There is no way you can handle them with your hands. You need to use tweezers. Since I'm making a pretty small PCB, I'm actually using both kinds of components. The LEDs will be through-hole and all the other components will be surface-mounted. Doing the layout of the PCB is actually quite easy. You just drag and drop the components and connect them together. The software actually helps you quite a lot, and there are tons of tutorials online to help you even more. When you are making a small PCB like this, the length of the connections doesn't really matter. But if you're making a large PCB, they can matter. But one thing that will matter is the placement of the LEDs. They will probably shine through the lens, so make sure you put them in a nice looking pattern. The artwork on the PCB is called a silk screen. It's mainly there to help you during assembly, but you can also use it just to make your PCB look a bit cooler. I decided to make my PCB round because my lens is round, but you can make more or less any shape you want. You can get really weird with it, and I think you should, because weird looking PCBs are just awesome. Before you send off the PCB to production, there is one more thing that you can do if you feel like it. And that is building the whole thing using a breadboard. If you have all the components on hand, that is actually a great way to make sure that your schematic checks out. I didn't do that this time around because I know that this schematic will work, but if this is your first time, it might make sense. It can save you a bit of headache down the road. Now it's time to send your PCB out for production. And if you're using EasyEDA, you will probably send it to JLC PCB, because those two are connected. But you can use EasyEDA and export your files and use it with a competitor like PCBWay if you want to. None of these companies has sponsored this video, so I'm just telling you what I used, and I used JLC PCB. And for a simple project like this, the default values will probably work. It did for me. And after a few days, you will get something that looks like this. Pretty exciting. And here you can clearly see why I used both through-hole components and surface-mounted components. All the through-hole components are mounted on the front, and all the other components are mounted on the back. If I used only through-hole components, quite honestly, they wouldn't fit on the PCB. The next step is to solder all the components into place. And this step might actually be optional. Let me explain. Most, if not all, the PCB making companies offers to solder your components onto your PCB in their factory. And that means that the only thing you will need to solder are your wires. It does come at a cost, but sourcing your own components costs as well. And if you're not planning to make more projects like this, it might be worth it. And if you're using those tiny surface mounted components, it might make a lot of sense to have the factory solder them for you. But I already had all the components, so I will solder them myself. And here it is, my finished taillight. As you saw, I started with the surface mounted components and then I soldered in the wires. Normally I would have saved the wires for last, but since the whole front is covered in LEDs, it would have been really hard to get my soldering iron into that little spot right there. My number one tip for soldering is use a lot of flux. And when you solder these small components, pre-thin the tip of the soldering iron and tack it into place, kind of like when you are welding. I used a 0.6mm soldering wire, but I would have loved to have something thinner. One thing that might make sense is to use a pair of helping hands. They can be really helpful. But one thing that isn't helpful is to ask your cat for help. I didn't know this, but apparently cats are terrible at soldering. With the PCBs ready, it's time to mount them to the bike, and I 3D printed these little brackets that would help me. Finally, time for some grinding and welding. Let me just get my overalls. But the taillights are finished and I think they turned out great. One step closer to a finished build. I hope you found this video helpful or inspirational or at least a little bit entertaining. Thank you so much for watching and I will see you later. Bye!